So it's perfectly apt that I'm talking to a medical audience. Well, you see the title, Bad Leadership, and you're wondering why I consider the topic of bad leadership to be apt for you in particular. So I'm going to not get personal, not to worry. I will tell you, though, quite seriously, that I have for years, I am, as was just told to you, a so-called leadership expert. But for years, I have deviated from the norm by focusing rather intensely on bad leadership, bad management. I'll consider for this purpose the words leadership and management interchangeable. Now, why do I say this is apt for a group like you, largely like you? Because for years I have compared bad leadership to a plague on the human condition, a plague that, as I will explain to you in a moment, is largely unaddressed and largely unattended to for reasons that are complicated, but I will give you a little bit of an idea of why and how. And at the end, as the title of the talk indicates, I will give you some idea, although I never mean to simplify this, of what is to be done about it. So I think you can all see the slides, and I will start by telling you some of our assumptions about leadership generally, most of which you can imagine I largely consider erroneous. Assumption number one, that anyone can lead, and some of you may be familiar with that, meaning you have had a boss, a leader, or a manager who got appointed to his or her position because of an expertise that had little or nothing to do with how to lead and manage. But we assume that if we appoint someone who seems in some way to merit it, that they'll know how to lead. That's a deduction that, again, I will question. We further assume, at least often, that no special expertise or experience is required. Now, let me name one name, and I promise you I am not being political. I am trying simply to make a point, which is that Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in 2016 without any expertise or experience in the military or in government. But we somehow assumed, the American people somehow assumed, that the arguably most important leadership position in the world could be assumed, further assumed, by someone who had no experience or expertise. We would not assume such a thing in any other line of work. Similarly, that no education or training is necessary. Similarly, that you too not only can learn how to lead, but you can learn how to lead quickly and easily. Take my course, read my book, take my executive education seminar, and you too will emerge an amazing leader or manager. Now, what did I conclude from that? I have a book titled, I have many books out there on leadership. One of them is called Professionalizing Leadership. And I'm very unhappy with my own profession, which I'll talk about in a second, which is that we assume that leadership is not a profession like medicine. It is, as I say on the slide, not even a vocation. You're a hairdresser, a truck driver, an electrician. They would all have to take courses. They would all have to be in some way credentialed, in many cases even licensed. Do you need any of that to be a leader or a manager? Have you ever heard of a leader or manager license or certification? Any need of proof that you can do the job? Absolutely not. Leadership is not a profession. It is not even a vocation. It is an occupation, something we do, somehow blessed by whatever or whoever, as if we naturally can do it. Now, one of my hobby horses, I have many of them, as you're going to deduce even in the next few minutes, one of them is this fixation on the person, on the individual, on the leader. But guess what? Leadership is not about a single individual. The leadership system, for years now, I have never written the word leadership. I'm always talking about the leadership system. What does a leadership system consist of? You see it in front of you, 3 parts, slightly more complicated than one part, the leader, but not very complicated. The leader is one. None of this is to diminish the importance of the leader. Number 2 is the other, the followers. You cannot have a leader without at least one follower. That's simply logic. And you cannot understand leadership and followership, leaders and followers, without looking at the contexts, plural, within which leaders and followers are embedded. In other words, you cannot separate the one from the other. All 3 are required to understand what is happening in any given situation. Now, I recently wrote an article. I started by saying that bad leadership is a plague that afflicts the human condition, and startlingly, we're forever feeling there's nothing we can do about it. Now, why I asked myself, given that I'm a card-carrying member of the leadership industry, why I asked myself, is this the case? Why is bad leadership a plague that somehow gets unaddressed? There are a billion books out there, and a billion classes and curricula and programs and workshops and seminars out there on how to be a good leader, but there is virtually nothing out there, and I mean virtually nothing, on how to stop a bad leader, on how to stop bad leadership. So, given that bad leadership is as pernicious as it is ubiquitous, why is it that we have trouble with it? So there are several different reasons, and I will give you only one, although if we were hanging out over a beer, we could go on. The one that I will give you is because of our differences of opinion. I will mention one other in a few moments. But the differences of opinion, by that I felt, when I mentioned the name Donald Trump a moment ago, I felt I had to apologize. Well, not exactly apologize, but I had to make clear to you that no, I was not being political, I was just being descriptive. That's because if you name a name, by the way, it doesn't have to be as incendiary an issue as who's running for president, just simply in ordinary parlance, it is entirely possible that your good leader might be my bad one, or even my very bad one. So my first deep foray into this was about 20 years ago when I wrote a book called Bad Leadership. Clever title, right? You're writing about bad leadership? Bad Leadership. And in that book, I established 2 very simple axes. One axis is a continuum. This is, again, how am I going to grapple with bad? So the 2 axes led me to a way to do it that seemed kind of non-controversial, although always there are differences of opinion, and also very illustrative, because I had once given a talk, even before that book, in which I said something like Hitler was a bad leader. I'm a political scientist by training, so I said Hitler was a bad leader. The words had no sooner come out of my mouth than somebody raised their hand and said, no, Hitler was a good leader. I'm talking about Hitler from a moral perspective, and he was talking about Hitler from a functional perspective. How effective was he? And if you know anything about German history, you will know that from 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, to 1939, when the First World War started, he was an extremely effective leader. So I can go on about Hitler being a bad leader between 33 and 39, and somebody was right to correct me, and I learned my lesson ever since. 2 axes, one from effective to ineffective, and the other intersecting axis from ethical to unethical. They refer to 2 totally different issues of how one can be good or bad, but they are both of extreme importance. It gives us a way to have the conversation without getting too hysterical about differences of opinion. So in the same book, and this is just to scan what I call the leadership universe, you will see I had 7 different types of bad leaders. And interestingly, I just mentioned the book came out 2 decades ago. These 7 types still hold up fairly well. I don't need to read them out loud. As you will see, they are self-evident, with one exception, which is an insular leader. An insular leader, that term is not so self-evident, but I define insular leadership as a leader who is concerned only with his or her own constituents and not with everyone else out there. Since I wrote Bad Leadership, I've been interested in the question of what do we do about it? How do we deal with this impossible subject? So let me give you a few points to remember. If we do not stop bad leadership, if we do not interrupt it or intrude on it or intervene in any way, bad leadership doesn't sometimes get worse. It doesn't usually get worse. It invariably gets worse. There virtually is no such thing as a bad leader who wakes up one morning and says, oh, golly gee, I've been bad. I really need to change my ways. I've been corrupt. I've been mean. I've been callous. I've even been evil. Silly me. I'm going to change. Doesn't happen. And what does that mean? Let's go back to the leadership system. It means that unless we, the followers, others, whatever, stop it, it will, I promise you, get worse. Now, how to understand the distortion of the human condition? Go back to the followers. So, when bad is left unchecked, all kinds of, am I allowed to say curse? I'm doing a TEDx, I better be careful. Okay. Stuff happens, okay? Stuff happens. I'm giving you a scant slide here on what happens. Now, what can we do? Can we do anything to stop bad leadership? A book I'm working on now is titled tentatively, Why Followers Follow. In other words, what's in it for us that we go along with people we describe are bad? Why don't we protest more? Why do we look at what's happening in the political world, or indeed in our own hospitals or other healthcare organizations, and have this riddle? Why does bad leadership happen? Why are we tolerating this? Why are we bitching and moaning, but unable somehow to do something about it? So I'll simply say here that there are bad reasons. In other words, we want power, we want money, we're greedy, we want to be careful, and there are good reasons. We're afraid that if we try to upend a bad leader, we are going to run into all kinds of trouble. Our safety will be compromised. Our security will be compromised. We won't get promoted. We will get punished professionally, personally, or politically. In other words, there are reasons we follow bad leaders, but are they good ones? That is an entirely different question. So, I'm going to end with this call to action. And it is a call to action because, as I said, bad leadership is a plague. Somehow the human species has managed to address, as you know better than anyone else, physical diseases. We see physical diseases and we're comfortable trying to fix them. We see psychological diseases, schizophrenia, diseases of the mind, and we are somehow comfortable trying to fix them. But for various reasons, what I call a social or sociological disease, bad leadership remains largely unaddressed, whether it is at the global scale, whether it's the Vladimir Putins of the world, or whoever is your bad leader. It depends, again, on your point of view. But we know that there are mean leaders, cruel leaders, evil leaders, murderous leaders at the global level. And we know from personal experience, because I've asked countless audiences, how many of you have never had a bad boss? And nobody raises their hand, because everyone can identify with having had at one point or another a boss, a leader, or a manager who was in some way bad. And everyone can identify with the sense of learned helplessness, that is, with regard to what to do about it. So my final slide, and again, I don't want to underestimate the difficulties involved. This can be risky business, in some cases very risky business, but at a minimum, my call to action is alerting you, making you more conscious. It's a kind of a consciousness-raising exercise of the plague of bad leadership and the fact that it is at least sometimes possible to do something about it. So you see the list here. Be a noticer. By the way, it's a Saul Bellow word. I don't know how many of you have ever read a novel by Saul Bellow. Notice, pay attention to what is going on around you. Notice the leader, but not just the leader. Notice everybody else. And other action terms, forge allies. Do what you can. Remember the progression that unless you stop it or at least slow it, bad leadership and management will inevitably get worse. So I don't mean to leave you on a down note. Yes, bad leadership and management, they are plagues with which virtually every one of us who's been in the adult world, who reads the news, who is present, is deeply and inevitably aware of. But that does not mean, it should never mean, that there is nothing we can do about it. And it is up to us, and it should be up to leadership experts, to do everything we can to raise our consciousness about bad leadership so that it translates eventually, as we get smarter about it and more sophisticated about it, into action. Thank you.